What is up, duelists, and welcome back to another Yu-Gi-Oh video. Sorry for no uploads on this channel last week. I was busy with the in-person Master Duel finals in Paris as well as the French Open, so I was gone for almost the entire week. But now I'm back and I want to continue to make content for you guys. So today we're talking about one of the things that you can do to improve at decision making in Yu-Gi-Oh. And I was thinking about making this one big video about like how to get good at Yu-Gi-Oh and like how to play Yu-Gi-Oh. And I realized in the process of making it, like, it's going to be way too long and way too much work for one singular video. And I'm just, with all the day-to-day stuff that I'm doing, I never get to finish it. So I decided to break it up into little bits and pieces that are maybe also a little bit easier to digest, because it's going to be like 10, 20, maybe 30-minute videos on like one specific topic on how to improve at the game, and then I'll just make them a little bit more regularly. And so you can let me know what you think of that after watching today's video, if you thought it was a good idea, if you want to see more of it, and so on and so forth. You know the drill. Without further ado, let's get started. Hope you enjoyed today's video. All right, so like I said, we're talking about decision making in Yu-Gi-Oh, and what I mean by this is how to interact with your opponent, because of course I've talked about deck choice and deck building in the past, but we can also talk about those again in the future if you guys want. Those are also important topics, but when it comes down to it, there's a lot of resources out there on which kind of decks are good at the moment. You can find a plethora of good deck lists, tournament topping deck lists for all kind of different playstyles out there. So technically finding a good Yu-Gi-Oh deck and just picking it up and bringing it to locals or whatever is easier than it's ever been in modern Yu-Gi-Oh, because also card prices at the moment are on, I feel like, an all-time low. Not everything is super affordable, don't get me wrong, but picking up a good deck list and getting the cards and playing the game with it is pretty much easier than it's ever been. But the thing is, everyone at tournaments these days, or at least a majority of people at tournaments these days, have good decks, right? So the thing that ends up differentiating the people that do well from the people that don't do so well are what kind of decisions you make in the game. Of course, there's a couple of edges to be gained in deck building and deck choices, but that's like more the super in-depth thing, like the difference between someone who makes top cut at a YCS and the one who's winning it is maybe some individual deck choices. But just consistently doing well at Yu-Gi-Oh events is mostly down to technical play and decision making, and a little bit of luck, of course, as it always is. But for the most part, understanding your own deck is at least only half of the equation, I would say, if not less. And understanding your opponent's decks is even more important. And the reason I say this is because one of the most common questions that people ask me, whether it's on Twitch or in YouTube comments, whenever a new deck comes out, or even if it's been out for a while, it doesn't matter if it's Master Duel or TCG, people ask me like, hey, where do I hand trap this deck? Where do I ash this deck? What's the best thing to use my infinite impermanence on, and so on and so forth. And like, I understand why people ask this, and don't feel called out if that's you, basically, in my comments, but I'm trying to talk about why I don't think that's the best approach when you're trying to actually do well in Yu-Gi-Oh! I mean, these are shortcuts, essentially, right? Like, what people are asking for in this instance is shortcuts. They're not trying to actually understand the deck. They're just trying to hear like, okay, ash the Branded Fusion, or ash the Rahu Draco Tail, or imperm the Arthalion, and so on and so forth. And while those things are good for a solid baseline, like when you're entering a tournament and you're low on time and you're just trying to figure out like, okay, like this rogue deck that I've never played against before, like just in case I play against it, what should I do against it? It's very human to want those little shortcuts and make it easy, but realistically, if you're trying to do as well as possible, they don't really exist. There is no rule in Yu-Gi-Oh that always applies. Even the most, like the most classic of interactions of ashing the Branded Fusion is something that it's very easy to find examples for where it doesn't apply. You know, like for example, when you're playing against Branded Draco Tail, there's a lot of game states in which the Branded Fusion is not the most threatening card, actually. You know, like you actually want to hold ash for a Rahu or a Ketu Draco Tail, because the things that Branded Draco Tail can do with the Branded Fusion might not be as powerful as the things they can do with a Rahu or a Ketu. So I found myself in game states where I let the Branded Fusion resolve and dealt with the stuff after. But then also, once again, same matchup, sometimes it is correct to ash the Branded Fusion depending on the game state. Even against Branded itself, there's game states where you don't hold the ash until the Branded Fusion, you instead ash the Aluber. You know, maybe not on the first turn, but if it's the middle of the game and they summon an Aluber and they already have a bunch of cards in the graveyard and they could just be searching a Branded in red and win the game with that, then you might have to ash the Aluber, because that's something that could happen to you if your opponent is smart and plays around the Branded Fusion, right? And these are things that rely on knowledge on your opponent's deck, which is one of the main things I want to focus on and emphasize on in today's video. Is at the end of the day, you got to understand not only how to play your own deck, but also how other decks in the format functions. We're going to have some examples on where like those typical rules of always do this or always do that don't apply, and just in general examples where knowledge on your opponent's deck is going to be fundamental to making proper decisions in Yu-Gi-Oh! Because at the end of the day, if you really break it down, if you really understand all of the cards that are in play, both on your side and your opponent's side, and you know your deck, you know your opponent's deck, most decisions in Yu-Gi-Oh! Are pretty logical. If you knew how your opponent's deck worked all the time, then you didn't have to ask where to ash, right? Basically. And it extends past hand traps. And one of the also really important things that you got to understand is that there's also decisions that can be right even though they don't work out, and decisions can be wrong even though they do work out. You know, like this is something that's regarded to as results oriented thinking. Just because you impermed that thing and it worked out does not mean that that was correct, or just because you decided to imperm that one thing and they had a way to dodge it does not mean that it was incorrect. For example, your opponent summons a Vanquish Soul Raisin and you decide to imperm it, knowing that they could have Heavy Borger or Caesar Valius, but you thought that it was worth in this position to imperm it because the chance that they have one of those was relatively low. They ended up having it anyways. You lose the game because of that. Does not necessarily mean it was wrong. Like, people will watch those games and it'll be super easy to say like, well, I wouldn't have impermed it. They could have had Heavy Borger. But in reality, if the chance of them having it is relatively low, it could be correct. It's a decision that you can make. You just got to stand by your decision, and you got to have the ability to look back at it and be like, yeah, I stand by that decision. I would do it again. Or, you know what, reconsidering with the cards that I knew from my opponent or whatever, like it wasn't the right choice. I should have held it for something else. But this is some of the things that we're going to talk about. A good example for this is Dracotail Lucius. I'm going to try to use examples from the current format a little bit. Dracotail Lucius is a card that when you have an infinite impermanence in your hand or any form of targeted negation, you have to consider that they could chain a Dracotail 5-mana to it, right? Which is something that if you didn't know Dracotail, which of course at this point everyone knows Dracotail, it's been around for a while, but like let's just pretend Dracotail is a new deck in the format and you're playing against it for the first time. If you don't know that 5-mana exists, you might be inclined to imperm a Dracotail Lucius. Now, here's the thing. Imperming a Dracotail Lucius is not straight up incorrect. There is game states and just situations where imperming a Lucius is completely fine. I'm gonna simplify it even further and say if your opponent has a Lucius and just one other card in hand, imperming the Lucius can be completely safe because they cannot chain 5-mana if it's just one other card in hand. So in a game state like that, imperming a Lucius is completely fine. Which, once again, the rule of never imperming a Lucius because they could have 5-mana does not give you that knowledge. If you just use that shortcut all the time, you're not going to make the optimal decision all the time. Next case, let's move away from hand traps a little bit because there's a lot of other situations and game states where stuff like this applies. Let's imagine your opponent activates a Rahu Dracotail and you have a Solemn Judgment. If you do not have knowledge of what the Dracotail deck does, right? Of course, Rahu Dracotail always reads like a really powerful card, so you might be inclined to Solemn Judgment it anyways. But let's just assume you don't understand what Dracotail is or what Dracotail does. Let's assume it's more of a rogue deck, and you decide to let the Rahu Dracotail go through. In this case, essentially, your opponent is just going to send the Dracotail Urgula to the graveyard more often than not, and that's just going to pop your Solemn Judgment. And then you haven't negated the Rahu because you were saving the Solemn Judgment for something else. And then, you know, you get punished for that, not knowing that Urgula existed. And you can use this example and you can apply it to so many other decks in the format, right? I'm just using Dracotail because it's a very common example, so people will understand what I'm talking about. But this is essentially what's happening every time when rogue decks activate cards that search or send from deck to graveyard or summon from extra deck something. Like, being aware of the options that your opponent has at any given time is so valuable in Yu-Gi-Oh! To make optimal decisions. And I'm not even saying that, like, I know all the things that all the rogue decks do. I am constantly in situations like this as well, where I'm playing against especially rogue decks. Like, I need to, like, kind of guess what's good to interact with or how to interrupt my opponent. Of course, simple, the more decks you know, the better. But, like, at least for, let's say, top 10, top 15, top 20 decks that you might find in a tournament, you should know this sort of stuff, right? I know there's a lot of Yu-Gi-Oh! Decks out there, and it's basically impossible to be familiar with every single one of them. But realistically, there's a solid chunk of decks in the format right now that you should absolutely know and be familiar with these kind of choke points. And at the same time, in this specific instance, it even goes deeper than this, because I think sometimes people use logic in a way that doesn't actually work, because they will simply say like, oh, because this could happen, I should not do this. The Lucius example earlier, like because they could have Phimena, I should not imperm the Lucius, which is not always true. And this does extend past singular cards. A lot of the time, it's also just knowing entire decks, their strategies, their lines, what kind of cards they want to open with. A good example of this is Backup Ad Ignister, right? A card that if you read it for the first time, maybe it doesn't sound that crazy. Like, you know, add one, discard one is something that, you know, in terms of the value that an Ash Blossom and Joyous Spring could gain, there could be bigger things that you could Ash in a deck if you're not familiar with what your opponent is playing. You know, there's cards out there that go +1 or +2 that you can Ash, so maybe you'd be inclined to not Ash the Backup Ad Ignister if you're reading it for the first time. But if you have an understanding of how the Malice deck works, and that the Malice deck in general doesn't want to normal summon Backup Ad Ignister, that is a very subpar opener, but also doesn't have that many other Ash targets these days, right? So if you understand these things, it's usually pretty obvious that it's correct to Ash Blossom a normal summon Backup Ad Ignister at the start of the turn. In general, just how decks play and how they're built plays into this a lot as well. An example of this is just also the non-engine that people use in the current format. Once again, these are simple examples, but I'm just trying to showcase how important these things can be, right? The fact that Orchest, for example, is a deck that can play Dominus Impulse, you don't get this info during the game until it's too late, until you've played into the Dominus Impulse, right? Like, because you never know, oh, all I'm seeing is dark monsters, but maybe there's more, maybe there's light monsters in the archetype that you simply don't know about. So you can never infer from seeing a couple of darks that, oh, this is definitely a Dominus Impulse deck. No, you have to know this. You have to know that Orchest is all darks and it can play Dominus Impulse, because otherwise there's no chance for you to just guess that during the game, right? I mean, okay, maybe after the 5th dark monster, you can have a rough idea of, oh, this is probably a Dominus Impulse deck, but there's no way to know for sure, right? Other things like, is the deck typically being played with hand traps? Is a deck typically being played with board breakers? How much non-engine space does a deck have to begin with, right? Like, because maybe if you're playing against a deck that is notoriously known for not having much space for non-engine, maybe it doesn't make sense to play around an Infinite Impermanence. Or Draco Tail, once again, great example for this, because deck usually wants to play mostly monsters, so in game 1, very unlikely that the set card they have is an Imperm. More likely it's going to be one of their 3 traps, which once again is something you need to know about. If they only set 1 or 2 from the deck and then set 1 card from hand, it's like, okay, well, that is a Draco Tail Sting, Draco Tail Horn, Draco Tail Flame, whatever you didn't see yet. That's going to enable you to make so much better decisions if you understand that that's what's going on. If we go into more of a rogue deck category, right, and we're looking at decks like Lunalight, which of course is a deck that's been around for a while by now, but I feel like it's a deck that still is, it is more of a rogue-ish deck, like let's say solid tier 2. It's a strong deck, people know this, but you don't play against it super often. So I feel like a lot of people don't actually have the practice that they need to make optimal decisions against Lunalight. And the thing is, this is one of the most punishing decks out there as well, if you make wrong decisions against it, because of course it is so polarizing, you know, like they either summon Liger or they don't, and usually when they summon Liger they win, and if they don't they lose. So making optimal decisions against it is super important. And I'll talk about in a second, like, how do you get to this point, in my opinion, the best. Just to further show what I mean, a card like Lunalight Fusion is a card that reads incredibly scary when you play against this deck, right? Like Fusion summoning a Lunalight and even being able to use a monster from your deck or extra deck as material sounds incredibly scary at first glance, but once again, you have to evaluate this in so many different scenarios, right? Because, like, let's say you're playing Draco Tail and you have a Draco Tail Flame, your opponent activates Lunalight Fusion, and you feel like you're forced to negate it because the card reads so powerful, and then the next thing they activate is a heavy poly and you lose the game because Liger hits the board, right? There's a couple of things to understand that, you know, if you know the Lunalight deck, you will understand these. You know, Liger needs 4 monsters, so if they have less than 3 unknown cards to you that could be Lunalight monsters, then Lunalight Fusion cannot summon Liger Dancer, because they need to send, they can send 1 from the extra deck, but they still need 3 other Lunalights in rotation to make a Liger Dancer with this. So if they have, let's say, 3 cards in hand, nothing else, and they activate Lunalight Fusion, even if they can use 1 material from deck or extra deck, they could not possibly summon Liger Dancer. Which, once again, we gotta think this one step ahead. That does not mean that you always let it resolve just because they can't summon Liger Dancer right now. You know, this is something that you might be inclined to think, but the card can still provide massive value even if it doesn't summon a Liger Dancer, right? It can still summon a Perfume Dancer, and that searches a perfume, and thinking all those steps through is something that you can only do if you know the cards, right? Because the threat that this card provides also changes depending on what else has been used so far in the turn, right? Lunalight has a couple of graveyard effects, right? They got Silverhound to summon a card from the deck. They have Yellow Marten to search for a Lunalight spell trap. And they have Emerald Bird to summon a Lunalight back from banished or graveyard. And they have Black Sheep that adds a polymerization. And they have Black Sheep, which adds a face-up Lunalight from extra deck or a Lunalight monster from grave back to their hand, right? As well as Kaleido Chick to add back a polymerization. So a bunch of effects that they could go for if they're used as fusion material. And so the threat of a Lunalight fusion changes based on what they've used on the turn so far, right? And then again, Lunalight Silverhound is a graveyard spell trap negation. So if you let the Lunalight fusion resolve and they have Silverhound in the graveyard already, there's a chance that they can simply negate your Dracotail Flame later on in the turn anyways. So many things going into that one decision on whether you flame the Lunalight fusion or not. There's no way of doing this properly all the time if you don't understand the deck. And I guess that's the point I'm trying to get to, is like, what can you actually do? Like, I hope I was able to make clear why all of this is so important to make optimal decisions in Yu-Gi-Oh! But then you might ask the question, okay, but how do I get there? Like, what's the best way to acquire this level of understanding about all of these different decks in the format? Because I understand that that's a lot, right? This is one of the biggest hurdles in Yu-Gi-Oh! And also why Yu-Gi-Oh! Is hard to pick up in the beginning, is because everyone always focuses, and it's the most fun and easiest to just focus on your deck, the deck that you like. You just play it, you try to optimize your lines. But in reality, the thing that's the hardest and requires the most work, but is also the most important, is understanding everything else, right? Understanding what everyone else is doing might even be more important than understanding your own. I think there's only 3 ways of doing this, I suppose. The one way is the theoretical way, like you can just look at all of the cards, all of the decks in the format, which is a fine way of doing things in the beginning. Just like reading all the cards, being aware of the things that they have in their extra deck, being aware of the things that they still have in their deck, because that's of course the thing where you can't pick that up during a game if it's about a card that hasn't even hit the board yet, right? Like a card that's in their extra deck or a card that's in their deck that they're about to send or search. Like, those are the things that you can't know beforehand unless you looked at them before the match. Of course, when your opponent normal summons something, then you can read it and think about what that does, but the information on what kind of cards are in their deck and extra deck and so on and so forth is something you have to acquire before the game starts. Otherwise, you won't have. Theoretically, looking at stuff is something that I think is great, but I also think it is limited in how much it can teach you. For me personally, I need some practical testing, some practical experience before I can judge these things. Like, Lunalight is a great example for this, because I learned so much about this deck when I started playing it myself for the first time. Like, even if it's a deck that doesn't really fit my style, it's not my favorite type of deck. It's fun to play, but it's just not my favorite. But when it came out in Master Duel, I played it for a while. I tested it, I ran a bunch of games with it, and it helped me understand so much, like the common situations that you find yourself in. Also, just in general, where interruptions really hurt. Because when you're playing against the deck, you sometimes you ash it and you have a feeling like, okay, that was good, that felt strong. Or banishing their normal summon, that felt good. Getting rid of the Kaleido Chick, that was good. But like, you never know for sure how much it really hurt them, or maybe you just won because they got unlucky, or maybe you lost because they got lucky, even though you interrupted at the right choke point, right? But when you play the deck yourself, you will find that, like, if my opponent ashes here, that's gonna hurt. Whether it happens or not is irrelevant, but you will think to yourself like, oh, if I get ashed here, that's gonna hurt. And then you're gonna recognize those spots when you're sitting across from a Lunalight player next time, right? You're gonna see like, oh, this spot, usually when I played this deck, if I got interrupted here, that hurt. So I'm going to interrupt them here and see if it works out. And once again, it might not work all the time, but at least you're making your decision with a conscious understanding of what their deck is. And that's all that matters. It doesn't matter that much if every single decision you make leads to a win, because not every decision is going to lead to a win. Sometimes they have the answers. Sometimes they have the right extenders, even though it was unlikely. Sometimes they play around your stuff perfectly, and so on and so forth. But at the end of the day, all that matters, all that you can control, is that you make the right decisions. So my personal favorite way of doing this is I like spending some time actually learning these decks myself. I want to play them myself. And whether that's online through Master Duel or other means, or whether it's maybe you have a friend you can borrow the deck from for a locals or two. You know, maybe you have someone in your testing group that you can borrow the deck from and just play it for a little bit. That might be super helpful. At the very least, if it's not playing the deck yourself, you can at least pick someone who plays the deck and then you sit down with them and you just run a couple of games and you actually talk about this, you know, like you talk about like, hey, do you think interrupting here was correct? Where should I have hit this? And so on and so forth. And ultimately, yes, this is a lot of work because you got to do this for a lot of different decks in the format. But at the end of the day, that's the only way you're going to make optimal decisions in Yu-Gi-Oh! And yeah, that's just something I wanted to ramble about. I guess the unfortunate news is that I don't really believe in these kind of shortcuts unless you literally don't have the time to do things and learn things properly, in which case I think it's completely fine to try and find a shortcut. If you're trying to be the best Yu-Gi-Oh player possible and really improve your game, then it's not enough to just learn your own deck. You gotta learn the other decks in the format. Not every single rogue deck, but at least everything you could realistically play against. In a tournament setting, you should be understanding it. Of course, to different degrees and all that kind of stuff, but it is just very, very important to make proper decisions in Yu-Gi-Oh! Let me know what you thought of this kind of ramble, and if there's any other topics that you would like to understand better in Yu-Gi-Oh! Then feel free to leave a comment and let me know. I'll try my best to make a couple of videos like this if people like them. And you can leave me suggestions on what I should talk about or what I should explain. And yeah, thank you so much for watching. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe if you like content like this. And I'll see you on the next one, Duelists. Bye-bye.